Your illegal wolf hybrids are a menace to this community, and I'm having them seized. The bylaws are explicit. No exotic animals. The voice was a grating symphony of entitlement and cheap perfume, a sound that scraped against the peaceful quiet of my 10-acre property like a rake on concrete. I turned slowly from the obstacle course where I'd been running Titan, a 90-pound Dutch shepherd with the intelligence of a cryptographer and the focus of a laser beam. Standing at my gate, framed by the wrought iron I'd installed myself, was a woman who could only be described as the final boss of Neighborhood Watch. She was plus-sized, squeezed into a pastel pink tracksuit that screamed, "Suburban Tyrant," and her face was a flushed mask of self-righteous fury. Flanking her were two county animal control officers, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable, and a middle-aged woman whose expression was one of weary resignation. This, I gathered, was Karen, the HOA president my realtor had vaguely warned me about with a nervous chuckle. Her eyes, small and hard, weren't on me. They were locked on Titan, who had ceased his weaving through the poles and now stood perfectly still, a coiled spring of disciplined energy, his gaze fixed on me, awaiting a command. To her, he wasn't a highly trained military asset. He was a monster. The word wolf was a weapon, and she wielded it with the precision of a cudgel. I could see the narrative she had built in her head, a fantasy of heroism where she, Karen, single-handedly saved the cul-de-sac from the slavering beast and its mysterious, probably dangerous owner. The financial loss of having my dogs seized was the least of it. These animals were government property, part of a crucial Department of Defense program. This wasn't just an overreach, it was an act of profound, staggering ignorance that threatened to derail work of national importance. My blood ran cold, but my face remained a mask of calm, a discipline drilled into me over 15 years of special operations. I gave Titan a low, single-word command, and he trotted to my side, sitting perfectly, his attention still locked on me, pointedly ignoring the commotion at the gate. The move was meant to show control, but to a mind like hers it was probably just more proof of my sinister power over the beast. She saw what she wanted to see, and what she wanted to see was a villain she could vanquish. This was the moment my quiet, post-military life ended, and a new war began. It's a crazy story, and it just gets wilder from here. If you're ready for the ride, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare, I want to hear about it. Now let me tell you how we got here. It all started with a promise I made to a dying friend in the dust of Afghanistan. His name was Sergeant Marcus Thorne, and his partner was a Belgian Malinois named Aries. They were the best K9 team I'd ever seen. We were on a high-risk extraction mission, and Aries scented an IED just seconds too late. The blast took them both. In his last moments, Marcus made me promise I wouldn't let their work be in vain, that I'd find a way to make the K9 program even better, to give our soldiers dogs that were smarter, faster, and more resilient than ever before. After I retired, that promise became my life's mission. I poured my life savings and my disability benefits into this property. It was perfect. 10 acres on the edge of a new development called Eagle's Crest, a name that dripped with manufactured patriotism. The lots were large, giving me the buffer I needed for the intense training regimens. I built a state-of-the-art kennel facility, an obstacle course that mirrored the official military standards, and a scent detection lab in a converted barn. I wasn't running a business. I was fulfilling a contract with the Pentagon, a specialized program to develop the next generation of military working dogs. The 3 dogs I had on site, Titan, a Dutch Shepherd, Nix, a sable Belgian Malinois, and Ghost, a massive all-black German Shepherd, were not pets. They were canine athletes, soldiers in training. Their bloodlines were impeccable, their training regimens were grueling, and their value was, in military terms, incalculable. I had submitted all the necessary paperwork to the county, secured the correct zoning variances for a government contractor, and even sent a courtesy letter to the HOA board before I closed on the property, briefly explaining the nature of my work in sanitized, unclassified terms. I received a generic welcome packet in response, and I foolishly assumed that was the end of it. I had underestimated the awesome, destructive power of a bored woman with a title. Karen's crusade, I would later learn, began with whispers over the back fence, paranoid theories concocted during her power walks. She saw my floodlights for nighttime training and imagined a clandestine cult. She heard the short, sharp barks of command and response drills and imagined the savage howls of a wolf pack. She saw me, a man who kept to himself and worked at all hours, and saw not a veteran dedicated to his mission, but a threat to her meticulously curated suburban utopia. The day she stood at my gate with animal control was not the beginning of her campaign. It was merely the first time she had dared to launch a direct assault. The young animal control officer cleared his throat, his eyes darting from Karen to me. "Sir, we received a complaint about potentially aggressive and exotic animals being kept at this residence." He held a clipboard like a shield. Karen puffed out her chest, her moment to shine. "They're wolf hybrids, I tell you. Look at the eyes and the size of them. They're going to get out and eat someone's poodle." I ignored her, addressing the officer directly, keeping my voice low and steady. "My name is Jack Caldwell. These dogs are not exotic animals or wolf hybrids. They are registered working dogs, specifically Dutch Shepherds and Belgian Malinois, owned by the U.S. government." I produced my wallet, showing him my government contractor ID. The officer leaned in to look, but Karen swatted at the air as if my credentials were a foul odor. "Forgeries! He's probably some kind of sovereign citizen nut job." "The bylaws are clear, officer. Section 7, Article C. No livestock, poultry, or exotic animals of any kind shall be raised, bred, or kept on any lot. I am the president of the Eagles Crest Homeowners Association, and I am enforcing our covenants." Her voice had risen to a shrill pitch, the kind that could peel paint. The older officer, the woman, finally spoke, her tone exhausted. "Ma'am, a Malinois isn't an exotic animal. We see them all the time. They're common police dogs." This was a bucket of water on Karen's bonfire, and she sputtered. But they look like wolves. He's training them to be killers. I hear them at all hours." I decided to set the hook. "Ma'am," I said, my voice dropping even lower, "these dogs are indeed being trained to kill, but only on command, and only a very specific type of person. Rest assured, you don't meet the criteria." The double meaning hung in the air. The young officer stifled a grin. The older one's lips twitched. Karen's face went from pink to a blotchy, furious crimson. It was a small, satisfying victory, but I knew the war was just beginning. She had shown her hand. She wasn't interested in the truth. She was interested in control. She had made me her project, and she would not stop until she had won or until she was completely and utterly destroyed. I looked from her furious face to the calm, powerful animal sitting at my side. Titan hadn't moved a muscle. He was the embodiment of disciplined strength, and in that moment, I knew I would have to be the same. I would not lose my temper. I would not be provoked into a mistake. I would be methodical. I would be relentless. And I would use her own rulebook to burn her kingdom to the ground. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought she was fighting some guy with scary dogs. She was about to find out she had just declared war on a man who had spent his entire adult life fighting actual monsters and who was very, very good at it. The officers, seeing no immediate threat and clearly sensing the situation was far more complex than a simple, dangerous dog call, made their excuses. They handed me a formal notice of the complaint, which I accepted with a polite nod, and informed Karen it was a civil matter for the HOA to handle unless a legitimate threat could be demonstrated. As they drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and shattered expectations, Karen was left standing at my gate, momentarily powerless. She wasn't defeated, merely thwarted. She glared at me, her eyes promising retribution. "This isn't over, Mr. Caldwell. I will have you and your monsters out of this neighborhood. I will see to it personally." I just gave her a small, tight smile. "I'm counting on it," I said, before turning my back on her, giving Titan the release command, and walking back toward my house, the sound of her sputtering rage fading behind me. The first shot had been fired. Now it was time to plan the counteroffensive. The first volley in Karen's paper-based war arrived 3 days later. It was a crisp, cream-colored envelope tucked officiously under the strap of my mailbox, bearing the Eagles Crest HOA logo, a soaring eagle that looked more like a constipated pigeon. Inside, printed on thick, self-important cardstock, were two separate violation notices. The first was a $50 fine for unapproved landscaping alterations, citing the professional-grade agility weave poles and the 6-foot A-frame scaling wall I had installed for the dogs. The second was a $100 fine for a nuisance barking complaint, claiming that excessive and aggressive vocalizations had been reported on 3 separate occasions. It was all nonsense, of course. The structures were training equipment, not a garden shed, and I had specifically chosen this property for its acreage to mitigate any noise. The barks she was hearing were controlled, command-based exercises, not the frantic yapping of a neglected pet. But the truth was irrelevant. This was harassment by 1,000 paper cuts. Karen was using the HOA bylaws as a cudgel, twisting vague language to suit her crusade. I laid the notices on my kitchen table, a gleaming stainless steel island that was usually covered in training logs and veterinary records. The fines themselves were trivial, but the strategy was clear: to bleed me with fees, to bog me down in bureaucracy, to make my life so unpleasant that I would simply give up and leave. It was a classic war of attrition. Unfortunately for her, I was a veteran of several. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything. I took high-resolution photographs of the violation notices, time-stamped and geotagged. I went outside and filmed a panoramic video of my property, narrating the distance from my training area to the nearest neighboring house, over 500 yards. I set up a sound level meter and ran Titan and Nix through their vocalization drills, recording the decibel levels, which barely registered above the sound of the wind rustling through the live oaks. I compiled a file labeling it HOA Engagement, K. Patterson. I learned her last name from the signature scrawled at the bottom of the notices. It was a spiky, aggressive signature, each letter a sharp jab of ink. I printed out a copy of the county zoning variance that explicitly permitted the construction of specialized training structures for my government contract work. I printed the section of the state code that protects working dogs from nuisance complaints related to their training. I was building an arsenal, not of weapons, but of facts. My response to the HOA was a model of detached, professional courtesy. I addressed it to the Eagles Crest Architectural Review Committee, even though I knew it was just Karen reading her own mail. I enclosed copies of my evidence, politely refuting each claim point by point, citing the relevant bylaws and state statutes. I paid the fines under protest to avoid late fees, making sure to note this on the check memo line, a small legal detail that could become important later. I sent the entire package via certified mail with return receipt requested. It was overkill, but I wanted a paper trail so thick it could choke a lawyer. A few days later, Karen escalated. A new notice appeared, this time taped directly to my front door, a clear act of trespass. The fine was now $250 for operating a commercial kennel in a residential zone. This was a significant escalation. She was no longer nibbling at the edges with landscaping and noise complaints. She was attacking the very core of my work. The notice was accompanied by a smudged, grainy photo of Ghost, my black German shepherd, standing near the kennel building. The caption below read, "Evidence of commercial breeding and boarding operation." It was absurd. Ghost was a male, and the other 2 dogs were also males. Breeding was biologically impossible. But again, the facts were secondary to the narrative she was weaving for the other residents. She was painting a picture of a shady, illegal puppy mill run by a dangerous recluse with a pack of wolves. And in the vacuum of information, fear was a powerful motivator. I saw her handiwork on the community Facebook page, a private group I'd been granted access to when I moved in. She had posted a community safety alert, a masterclass in veiled paranoia. She never mentioned my name, only referring to a new resident on Lot 14 and his large, wolf-like canines. She warned residents to keep small pets indoors and to be vigilant with their children. She mentioned unusual activity at all hours and structures being built without HOA approval. She concluded with the chillingly vague phrase, "The board is actively monitoring the situation and taking all necessary steps to ensure the safety and property values of our community." The comments section was a cesspool of fear and speculation. "Are they even legal?" one person asked. "I heard one of them howl last night," wrote another, An impossibility since none of my dogs were howlers. Thank you for being so proactive, Karen, gushed a sycophant. I felt a cold anger settle in my gut. This wasn't just about me anymore. She was slandering me, endangering my mission, and turning my neighbors against me with lies. She was poisoning the well. I saved screenshots of the entire thread, adding them to my growing file. I knew trying to fight her in the court of public opinion on a Facebook page she controlled would be a fool's errand. Any comment I made would be deleted and I'd be banned. No, the counterattack had to be smarter. It had to be bigger. It had to come from a place she couldn't control. I drafted another, more forceful letter to the board, demanding a retraction of the slanderous post and a cessation of all harassment. I also included a formal request, as was my right under the HOA's own governing documents, for a complete copy of the association's financial records for the past 3 years, all meeting minutes, and a current roster of all board members. This was no longer a defensive action. I was going on the offensive. I was going to dissect her little fiefdom, piece by piece, and find the rot I knew was hiding beneath the surface. An organization run with this much aggressive incompetence had to be hiding something. People who crave that much power are almost always compensating for a deep-seated insecurity or concealing a dirty secret. I suspected Karen Patterson was guilty of both. The certified letter went out the next morning. The return receipt would be her signature on the declaration of a war she had no idea how to fight. She thought she was just bullying the new guy. She was about to find out she had kicked a hornet's nest, and the hornets had access to lawyers, government contracts, and a level of strategic discipline she couldn't possibly comprehend. The game was afoot. The HOA's response to my request for financial records was telling. It came not in a crisp envelope, but in a flimsy manila folder left on my doorstep, containing a single, poorly photocopied page. It was a laughably simplistic budget summary for the current year, with broad, vague categories like landscaping, $50,000, administrative, $25,000, and community events, $15,000. There were no detailed expense reports, no bank statements, no meeting minutes as I had requested. It was a document designed to reveal nothing, an act of malicious compliance. The message was clear. You'll get what we choose to give you. The board roster listed 3 names: Karen Patterson, President, Brenda May, Treasurer, and Gary Shipley, Secretary. A quick search of county property records confirmed my suspicion. Brenda and Gary were her next-door neighbors, her loyal lieutenants in this suburban kingdom. This wasn't a board, it was a clique. Realizing that a direct approach was a dead end, I shifted tactics. It was time for reconnaissance. I started taking my morning runs at a different time, mapping a route that took me through the entire Eagles Crest development. I wasn't just running, I was observing, listening. I saw the little tyrannies of Karen's reign everywhere. I saw the house with the perfectly manicured lawn that had a small, discreet sign for a home-based accounting business in the window. A few days later, a bright orange HOA violation sticker was slapped on their front door. I saw the family with the brand new playset in their backyard, and I overheard a snippet of conversation between the husband and another neighbor as I ran past. Can you believe it? She said the shade of blue on the slide wasn't on the approved color palette. The other neighbor just shook his head and muttered, "That's Karen for you." I struck up a conversation with an older gentleman named Arthur Vance, a retired civil engineer who was meticulously weeding his rose bushes. I introduced myself, and when I mentioned I was on Lot 14, his eyes widened slightly. "Ah," he said, wiping his brow with a gloved hand. "You're the wolf, man." I chuckled. "That's what I hear. Name's Jack." We talked for a while about the weather, his roses, his time working on city infrastructure projects. I could sense a sharp, analytical mind behind his gentle demeanor. Finally, I decided to probe. "Getting a bit of a welcome wagon from your HOA president," I said lightly. Arthur snorted, a dry, rustling sound. "Karen Patterson is a weed," he said, yanking a stubborn bit of crabgrass from the soil. "She gets in everywhere, chokes the life out of things, and is impossible to get rid of. She's been running this place like her personal fiefdom for 5 years." He told me stories. How Karen had tried to fine him for his garden gnome collection, claiming they were unapproved lawn ornaments. how she had the HOA pay for a lavish community barbecue that was, in reality, a birthday party for her daughter, attended only by her friends. How she used the HOA's legal counsel to send threatening letters to anyone who dared to challenge her. Most people just pay the fines, Arthur said, his voice laced with resignation. It's easier than fighting her. She thrives on conflict. Wears you down. I found my first potential ally. She denied my request for the full financial records, I told him, sent me a one-page summary. Arthur's eyes lit up with a familiar spark of indignation. Of course she did. She's been stonewalling those requests for years. The bylaws state any homeowner can inspect the books with 10 days' notice. She just ignores it. Says the summary is sufficient. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. I was on the board, for about 6 months, right after I moved in. I started asking questions about the landscaping contract, seemed awfully high for the work being done, found out the company is owned by her brother-in-law. When I brought it up at a meeting, she orchestrated a smear campaign, accused me of trying to get a kickback for a company a friend of mine owned. The whole thing was a lie. I resigned. It wasn't worth a headache. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place. This wasn't just about power, it was about graft, nepotism, embezzlement, and a complete lack of transparency. Her crusade against me wasn't just a personal vendetta, it was also a convenient distraction, a way to rally the community against a manufactured villain so they wouldn't look too closely at the real one. I spent the next week digging. Using my military intelligence gathering skills, I delved into public records. I found the business registration for Eagle's Crest Premium Landscaping, the company Arthur mentioned. It was indeed registered to one Stanley Patterson, Karen's brother-in-law. I ran a search for other contracts held by the company. They had none. Their only client was the Eagle's Crest HOA. The address listed for the business was a P.O. box. I did a deep dive on social media, finding Stanley's public profile. It was filled with pictures of him on expensive fishing trips, driving a brand new pickup truck, and showing off a recently purchased bass boat, all on a single suspiciously lucrative landscaping contract. I cross-referenced the HOA's budget summary with average landscaping costs for a development of our size. The numbers were off. By my conservative estimate, the HOA was overpaying by at least 40%, a surplus of $20,000 a year that was likely being kicked back to Karen. It was a classic, small-time grift, but it was enough. I also found my legal weapon. Buried deep in the HOA's own governing documents in a section about dispute resolution was a clause almost everyone ignores. It stated that if the board failed to comply with a legitimate document request from a homeowner within 30 days, the homeowner had the right to hire an independent forensic accountant to audit the books at the HOA's expense. It was a fail-safe, a check on the board's power that Karen had either forgotten or, in her arrogance, assumed no one would ever find. I had made my request via certified mail. The 30-day clock was ticking. She had just given me the key to unlock her entire corrupt enterprise. My documentation folder was no longer just about defending myself. It was now an indictment. It contained photos, videos, audio recordings, sworn affidavits I was collecting from neighbors like Arthur, public records, financial analyses, and screenshots of Karen's online slander. I was no longer just fighting back against a bully. I was building a case that would not only exonerate me, but would also liberate the entire community from her toxic reign. The quiet satisfaction I felt was immense. She thought she was dragging me into a bureaucratic swamp to drown me. She didn't realize that I was an alligator, and she was in my swamp now. The official-looking envelope from the County Planning Commission arrived on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. The air was thick and heavy, and the paper felt limp in my hands. Karen had made her big move. Inside was a formal notice of a hearing. The Eagle's Crest HOA had filed a petition to have my property cited for a major zoning violation, operating an unpermitted commercial enterprise in a residential agricultural zone. The language was dense with bureaucratic jargon, but the intent was crystal clear. This wasn't a $50 fine for unapproved bird bass. This was an existential threat. If the county sided with her, they could issue a cease and desist order, effectively shutting down my training program. The fines would be in the thousands. and the legal battle to appeal would be a long, draining siege. I could see her strategy laid out like a battle map. She had failed to intimidate me with petty fines and failed to oust me with animal control. Now she was bringing in the heavy artillery of county government. She was banking on the system's inertia, its inherent suspicion of anything out of the ordinary. A guy training attack dogs for the military next door? It sounded scary. It sounded like a liability. To a risk-averse county board, the easiest path would be to shut it down. She had also, I noted with a grim smile, made a critical error. By escalating the conflict to an official county hearing, she had moved the battlefield from her private kingdom, the HOA meetings and the community Facebook page where she controlled the narrative, to a public forum governed by rules of evidence and legal precedent. She thought she was dragging me onto her turf, but she was actually stepping onto mine. I sat down at my kitchen table and spread the documents out. The hearing was scheduled in 4 weeks. Ample time to prepare. My file on Karen was already 3 inches thick, but it was focused on her malfeasance within the HOA. Now I needed to build a case to defend my own operations. I pulled out my contract with the Department of Defense. It was a hefty document, filled with classified annexes and non-disclosure agreements, but the core statement of work was clear. I was a civilian contractor, not a commercial business owner in the traditional sense. My property was designated as a canine development and training facility for government use. I wasn't selling services to the public. I was fulfilling a federal mandate. This distinction was crucial. Next, I called Arthur Vance. I explained the situation, and he let out a low whistle. "She's really going for the jugular," he said. "The county commission is a tough nut to crack. They're mostly old ranchers and small business owners who don't like anything that smells complicated." "Arthur," I said, "you're a retired civil engineer. You've dealt with these commissions before. What's the best way to approach them?" "Data," he said without hesitation. "They don't respond to emotion. They respond to facts, figures, and precedent. You need to show them you're not a risk. You need to show them you're an asset. And you need to do it without looking like a slick city lawyer talking down to them." He offered to review the county zoning codes with me, to help me frame my argument in language the commission would understand. His help would be invaluable. My second call was more significant. It was to a number I hadn't dialed in over a year. It connected me to the office of Colonel James Matthews, my program liaison at the Pentagon. He was a no-nonsense infantry officer who saw the world in terms of mission objectives and strategic assets. He was also the man who had championed my proposal for this advanced training program. His secretary put me through immediately. "Jack," he boomed, his voice gravelly but sharp, "don't tell me one of your dogs has learned how to file its own expense reports." "Not yet, sir," I replied, a small smile touching my lips. "But I have a situation here. A local matter that's threatening to interfere with the training schedule." I laid it all out for him. The HOA president, the harassment, the false complaints, and now the county zoning hearing. I was careful to frame it not as a personal problem, but as a potential impediment to mission readiness. I used phrases like operational security risk and interruption of asset development pipeline. I wasn't just some guy complaining about his neighbor. I was a contractor reporting a threat to a government project. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could picture Colonel Matthews leaning back in his chair, his brow furrowed, processing the tactical implications. "A homeowners association," he finally said, the words dripping with disbelief and contempt. "An HOA is trying to shut down a DoD-backed Special Operations Support Program. That's the long and short of it, Colonel." "Have you sent them a strongly worded letter?" he asked, a hint of dry humor in his voice. "I've sent several, sir. I don't believe this individual is receptive to strongly worded letters." "No," he mused. "I suppose not." Another pause. "All right, Jack. I want you to email me a sit rep. Everything you have. The complaint, the hearing notice, your documentation on this. Karen, I'll have the JAG office take a look. We can't have local politics interfering with national security. Let me see what assets I can deploy to your area of operations." The words "deploy assets" sent a small shiver of anticipation down my spine. I knew what that meant. The Pentagon's legal arm, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, was a formidable force. Karen thought she was playing checkers with a lone king. She was about to find out the other side of the board was filled with queens, rooks, and bishops she never even knew existed. I spent the next few hours compiling the email to Colonel Matthews. I attached my meticulously organized files, a timeline of events, and a summary of the key players. I hit send and felt a profound sense of relief, the feeling a soldier gets when he knows air support is on the way. The battle was far from over, but the strategic balance had just shifted dramatically. Karen was marching her little army of bylaws and complaints onto the field, confident of victory. She had no idea that I was about to call in an airstrike. The 4 weeks leading up to the hearing would be busy. I would continue my own preparations, working with Arthur to build an ironclad defense based on local ordinances. But now a much larger, more powerful force was moving in the background, its gears turning silently. Karen Patterson had picked a fight with me. She was about to learn she was actually fighting the United States Department of Defense. And that was a fight she could not possibly win. With the legal and military wheels turning in the background, I focused on the front that mattered most, my own community. Karen's power was derived from the consent, or at least the apathy, of the other homeowners. She had successfully isolated me and painted me as a monster. It was time to tear down that narrative with the simple, undeniable truth. I decided to host an event, a community information and safety demonstration, as I billed it. I designed a simple but professional-looking flyer, and instead of relying on the compromised HOA channels, I printed 200 copies and spent an afternoon walking the entire neighborhood, placing one in every mailbox myself. The flyer invited all residents of Eagles Crest to my property the following Saturday for coffee, donuts, and a demonstration of the work I do. It promised to answer any and all questions and address the recent concerns that had been circulating. It was a direct challenge to Karen's monopoly on information. I knew she would try to stop it. The evening after the flyers went out, I received a furious email from her official HOA president account. It was a masterpiece of barely controlled rage, riddled with typos and exclamation points. She accused me of soliciting on private property, violating community gathering rules, and creating a public nuisance. She threatened me with a litany of new fines and informed me that she was instructing the community's private security patrol to be on high alert. I replied with a single polite sentence. "Thank you for your email, Karen, but as this event is being held on my private property and attendance is voluntary, it falls outside the purview of the HOA's authority." I CC'd my lawyer. I never heard back. Saturday arrived bright and clear. I had set up a designated parking area in my front pasture and arranged several dozen folding chairs in a wide semicircle around the primary training field. A table with 2 large coffee urns and several boxes of donuts sat nearby. For the first 20 minutes, I was worried no one would come. The chairs sat empty under the morning sun. I started to think Karen's campaign of fear had been more successful than I'd imagined. Then the first car pulled in. It was Arthur Vance and his wife, then another, and another. Soon, a steady stream of vehicles was making its way up my long driveway. People were curious. They were tired of hearing only one side of the story. In the end, nearly 50 people showed up, a mix of families with young kids, older couples, and young professionals. They milled about awkwardly, sipping coffee, their eyes darting toward the kennel building. I saw Karen and her 2 cronies, Brenda and Gary, standing at the edge of the crowd near the road, their arms crossed, faces like thunderclouds. They were there to observe, to intimidate, to gather ammunition for their next attack. I welcomed everyone, thanked them for coming, and then I got straight to the point. "I know there's been a lot of talk and concern about me, my property, and especially," I said, pausing for effect, "my dogs. I'm here today to replace fiction with fact." I gave them a brief, sanitized version of my background, my military service, my expertise in canine handling, and my current role as a contractor for the Department of Defense. I explained that the dogs were not pets, but highly specialized working animals in training to protect American soldiers overseas. Then it was time for the main event. I brought out Nyx first, my beautiful sable-colored Belgian Malinois. She was a bundle of coiled energy, but she walked at my side with perfect discipline. The crowd instinctively tensed. I saw a few parents pull their children closer. "This is Nyx," I said. "She's 2 years old. Her specialty is explosive ordnance detection. I walked her over to a line of 5 identical metal boxes. I explained that in one of the boxes, I had placed a small, inert training sample with the same chemical signature as C4 explosive. Her job was to find it. I gave the command. Nix moved down the line, sniffing each box with intense focus. When she reached the third box, she stopped, sat down, and looked back at me. She didn't bark. She didn't scratch. She didn't make a sound. She just sat. It was a passive alert designed to avoid disturbing a potential trigger. That's her indication, I explained. No aggression, no noise, just a simple, clear signal. A murmur went through the crowd. I opened the box and showed them the training aid. I then invited a small boy from the crowd, whose mother looked particularly nervous, to come forward. I handed him a tennis ball. "Throw it for her," I said. The boy tossed the ball, and Nix, on my release command, bounded after it with joyful, puppy-like enthusiasm, her tail wagging furiously. She brought it back and dropped it at the boy's feet. The tension in the crowd evaporated, replaced by smiles and soft laughter. This wasn't a monster. This was a dog. An incredibly smart, well-behaved dog. Next, I brought out Titan, my Dutch Shepherd. Titan's specialty is patrol and apprehension, I announced. This got the crowd's attention again. I had a helper, a fellow veteran and friend, put on a heavily padded bite suit. I explained the process, how the dogs are trained to bite and hold, not to slash and tear, and to release instantly on command. The demonstration was dramatic. Titan, on command, launched himself across the field, a blur of brindle muscle. He hit the suit with controlled force, latching onto the padded arm. The crowd gasped, but the most important part came next. While Titan was still holding the bite, I gave the release command. He let go instantly, backing away and sitting, watching the suspect, but not re-engaging. The control was absolute, breathtaking. I showed them Ghost's tracking abilities, how he could follow a scent trail I'd laid earlier that morning. I answered every question they had about the dog's diet, their daily routine, their temperament. I let the children, with their parents' permission, come up and pet Nix, who soaked up the attention. The monster had been demystified. Then for my final act, I turned the topic to the HOA. "Now that you know the truth about my work," I said, my voice resonating with authority, "I think it's time you learn the truth about how your HOA is being managed." I pulled out a large whiteboard. On it, I laid out the numbers I had uncovered, the inflated landscaping contract, the lack of financial transparency, the money going to Karen's brother-in-law. I showed them copies of my ignored request for documents. I passed around copies of Arthur's sworn affidavit about his experience on the board. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was giving them the tools to fight for themselves. The mood shifted from curiosity to anger. People started talking amongst themselves, sharing their own stories of Karen's petty fines and bullying tactics. The woman whose son's playset was the wrong shade of blue spoke up. The accountant with the violation sticker on his door chimed in. A dam of resentment was breaking. From the edge of the property, I saw Karen's face turn a shade of purple I had previously only seen in a sunset. She was losing control of the narrative, of her people, of her kingdom. She turned on her heel and stormed off, her 2 cronies scurrying behind her. It was a full-scale retreat. As the event wound down, people came up to me, not with fear, but with gratitude. They shook my hand. They thanked me for my service and for my honesty. Arthur clapped me on the shoulder. "You did it, son," he said, a grin splitting his face. "You just started a revolution." Looking at the faces of my neighbors, I knew he was right. I hadn't just won a battle for public opinion. I had forged an alliance. The hearing with the county was still to come, but I would not be going into it alone. I would be going with the full support of a community that was finally awake and very, very angry. The day of the county zoning commission hearing dawned gray and overcast, a perfect mirror of my own grim resolve. I put on a conservative suit and tie, a uniform of a different sort, designed for a different kind of battlefield. Arthur met me at my house and we drove to the county administrative building together. He was carrying a worn leather briefcase filled with zoning maps and copies of local ordinances he had tabbed and highlighted. He had been an invaluable strategic partner, helping me translate my military precision into the language of civic bureaucracy. As we walked into the hearing room, a sterile, wood-paneled space that smelled of old coffee and quiet desperation, I saw that Karen was already there. She was seated at the petitioner's table, flanked by a slick-looking lawyer in an expensive suit. Her two board cronies, Brenda and Gary, sat in the front row of the public gallery like loyal but anxious foot soldiers. Karen was dressed in a severe navy blue pantsuit, her serious business attire. She shot me a look of pure, triumphant venom as I took my seat at the respondent's table. She believed this was her kill shot, the final, decisive blow in her campaign. She had the home field advantage, a lawyer, and what she thought was an unassailable position. The 5 members of the zoning commission sat on a raised dais, looking bored and tired. They were local fixtures: a cattle rancher, the owner of a hardware store, a retired school teacher, the head of the local bank, and a real estate developer. They had the weary air of people who had sat through countless arguments about fence lines and septic tanks. My case was just another folder in a tall stack of petty disputes. The commission chairman, a stout man with a drooping mustache named Henderson, called the meeting to order and droned through the opening formalities. Then he announced our case. Petition 2023-Z74, a complaint filed by the Eagles Crest Homeowners Association regarding alleged zoning violations at 14 Eagles Crest Drive. Karen's lawyer, a man named Davenport, rose smoothly to his feet. He launched into a polished, persuasive opening statement. He painted a picture of a peaceful, family-oriented community suddenly blighted by a mysterious and threatening presence. He used loaded words like quasi-military compound, aggressive wolf-like animals, an undisclosed commercial operation. He presented the commission with a thick binder of evidence, which I could see from across the room contained grainy photos of my dogs, copies of the violation notices she had sent me, and a petition signed by, I counted, a mere 15 residents, most of whom, I later learned, lived on Karen Street. He argued that my facility was a commercial kennel, plain and simple, and that it posed a danger to the community, threatened property values, and violated the letter and the spirit of the county's residential agricultural zoning laws. It was a compelling performance, full of half-truths and skillfully crafted innuendo. I could see some of the commission members nodding along, their expressions growing more concerned. Karen sat beside her lawyer, a smug, self-satisfied smirk on her face. She was winning. When it was my turn, I walked to the podium alone. I had declined to hire a lawyer for this stage, a calculated risk. I wanted to speak to them directly, man to man, not through a high-priced intermediary. I introduced myself and gave them a brief, unadorned summary of my military background. I spoke not of combat, but of service, duty, and the sacred bond between a soldier and his K-9 partner. Then, just as I was about to present my own evidence, my DOD contract, my zoning variance documents, Arthur's analysis of the codes, the main doors at the back of the hearing room swung open with a soft whoosh. The sound was quiet, but in the tense silence of the room, it was as loud as a thunderclap. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway were 3 figures. The man in the center was tall and imposing, even in his late 50s. He had short-cropped gray hair, a jawline that could cut glass, and an air of absolute, unshakable authority. He was wearing the immaculate dress uniform of a full colonel in the United States Army, his chest a rainbow of service ribbons and commendations. On his left and right were 2 younger officers, a man and a woman, both captains, in identical uniforms, carrying sleek leather briefcases. They were JAG officers, military lawyers. The air in the room changed instantly. The bored, bureaucratic atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a sudden, palpable tension. The commission members, who had been slouching in their chairs, sat bolt upright. Chairman Henderson's jaw went slack. Karen and her lawyer stared, their mouths agape, their polished presentation instantly forgotten. The 3 officers walked down the central aisle with the measured, purposeful stride of men who were accustomed to being in charge. They didn't look at me or at Karen. They walked directly to the podium I had just vacated. Colonel James Matthews, my Pentagon liaison, had arrived, and he had brought the cavalry. He stepped up to the microphone, his presence commanding the absolute attention of everyone in the room. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. The uniform did it for him. Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, he began, his voice a low, powerful baritone that filled the space without any need for amplification. My name is Colonel James Matthews, United States Army. I am the program director for the Asymmetric Warfare Group's K-9 development project at the Pentagon. I am here today to speak on the matter of the facility operated by Mr. Jack Caldwell. The room was dead silent. Karen's face had gone from smug and triumphant to a pale, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. Her lawyer looked like he had just seen a ghost. They had come prepared to fight a disgruntled homeowner. They were now facing the full uniform might of the U.S. military. The game had just changed and they didn't even know the new rules. Colonel Matthews placed his hands on the sides of the podium, his posture radiating an authority that made the county commissioners look like schoolboys in the principal's office. Let me be perfectly clear, he continued, his gaze sweeping across the dais, making eye contact with each commissioner. The facility operated by Mr. Caldwell at 14 Eagles Crest Drive is not a commercial kennel. It is not a private business. It is a designated auxiliary training facility for the United States Department of Defense, established under a priority national security contract. He nodded to one of the JAG captains, who stepped forward and placed a thick, leather-bound binder on the desk in front of Chairman Henderson. The thud of the binder echoed in the silent room. In that binder, the colonel said, you will find a non-classified summary of Mr. Caldwell's contract, letters of commendation for his past service, and letters of support for this current project from my office and from the office of General Mark Peterson, commander of the U.S. Army Special Operations Command. The mention of a four-star general's name hung in the air like a physical weight. The commissioners stared at the binder as if it were a live bomb. Furthermore, Colonel Matthews went on, his voice dropping slightly, taking on a harder edge, you will find a legal brief prepared by my staff, outlining the superseding authority of the federal government in matters of national defense. Specifically, it cites Title 10 of the U.S. Code, which grants the Department of Defense broad powers to establish facilities and conduct training deemed essential to the nation's security, powers which, I must emphasize, preempt local and county zoning ordinances. He paused, letting the legal implications sink in. To put it in layman's terms, gentlemen, this commission does not have the jurisdiction to interfere with Mr. Caldwell's work. Karen's lawyer, Davenport, finally seemed to shake off his stupor. He rose shakily to his feet. Objection. Mr. Chairman, this is highly irregular. We had no prior notice that representatives of the U.S. military would be testifying. Colonel Matthews turned his head slowly and fixed Davenport with a look of icy contempt. It was a look I had seen colonels give to underperforming lieutenants, a look that could freeze water. Counselor, the colonel said, his voice dangerously quiet, this is not a testimony. This is a notification. I am here to inform this commission of the facts so that they do not inadvertently take an action that could be construed as interference with the operational readiness of the United States Armed Forces, an action which would have significant and regrettable consequences. The threat was not veiled. It was delivered with the cold, hard precision of a sniper's bullet. The JAG officers behind him stood perfectly still, their expressions unreadable, which was somehow more intimidating than if they had been scowling. Davenport seemed to shrink. He mumbled something about procedural fairness and sat down, his face pale. The fight had gone out of him. All his bluster and polished courtroom maneuvering was useless against this. Chairman Henderson, for his part, looked terrified. He was a local rancher who probably thought the most powerful person he'd ever have to deal with was a state senator. Now he had the Pentagon in his hearing room. He fumbled with his papers, his hands trembling slightly. Colonel, Matthews, sir, he stammered. We were unaware of this. The petition from the HOA made no mention of any federal involvement. Precisely, the colonel said, turning his gaze toward Karen's table. It seems the petitioner, Ms. Karen Patterson, has engaged in a campaign of harassment and misinformation against a critical defense contractor, based on what I can only assume is a profound and willful ignorance. She has wasted the time of this commission, she has slandered a decorated veteran, and she has attempted to obstruct a program vital to the safety of our soldiers in the field. Every word was a hammer blow. Karen, who had been sitting frozen, now seemed to crumble in her chair. The smugness was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified realization of the magnitude of her miscalculation. She had wanted to be the hero of her little neighborhood, the brave president who stood up to the scary man with the wolves. Now, in a public forum, she was being branded as an unpatriotic obstructionist by a high-ranking military officer. Her worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. Colonel Matthews had one last card to play. He looked back at the commission. Mr. Caldwell's program is responsible for training the dogs that find the roadside bombs that would otherwise kill or maim your sons and daughters serving overseas. The dogs he trains are, without exaggeration, lifesavers. Any delay in their training, any disruption to his work, directly increases the risk to American troops. I trust the members of this commission will weigh that fact carefully. With that, he nodded curtly to the chairman, turned, and walked back down the aisle with his entourage, their footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. They didn't wait for a response. Their mission was accomplished. They had delivered the message. The rest was a formality. Chairman Henderson cleared his throat, which sounded unnaturally loud. He looked at Karen's lawyer. Mr. Davenport, in light of this new information, do you wish to proceed with your petition? Davenport stood up, gathered his papers with a defeated air. No, Mr. Chairman. At this time, my client wishes to withdraw the petition. Petition withdrawn, Henderson said, banging his gavel with a relieved finality. This matter is dismissed, with prejudice. The words "with prejudice" were the final nail in the coffin. It meant the case could never be brought before the commission again. It was over. Karen had fired her biggest gun, and the target had fired back with a battleship. As the room began to stir, I caught Karen's eye. The look on her face was not anger or defiance. It was the hollow, shattered look of someone whose entire world, a world built on petty power and imagined authority, had just been utterly and completely annihilated. She had lost, but her downfall was only just beginning. The news of Karen's public humiliation at the county hearing spread through Eagle's Crest like a wildfire. Arthur, who had witnessed the whole thing with undisguised glee, had already called half a dozen people before we even got back to our cars. The story was just too good, too cinematic to remain a secret. The HOA president who tried to shut down a top-secret military program and got dressed down by a Pentagon colonel. It was the stuff of neighborhood legend. The immediate effect was a seismic shift in the community's power dynamics. The fear that Karen had so carefully cultivated for years evaporated overnight. She was no longer an intimidating tyrant. She was a laughingstock, a cautionary tale. Her authority, which had always been an illusion propped up by bluff and bluster, had been exposed as a fragile facade. The sycophants who had once praised her on the community Facebook page fell silent. The residents she had bullied for years were now emboldened. The dam of resentment had not just broken, it had been dynamited. That weekend, a flyer appeared in every mailbox, not from me, but from a newly formed Eagle's Crest Concerned Homeowners Committee, with Arthur Vance listed as the primary contact. The flyer called for an emergency meeting of the HOA to be held at the community clubhouse. The agenda was simple and brutal. First, a motion for a full, independent, forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years. And second, a vote of no confidence to remove Karen Patterson and the entire current board from their positions. This was the revolution Arthur had predicted, and it was happening faster than I could have imagined. I had provided the spark, but the residents themselves were now fanning the flames. Karen made one last, desperate attempt to cling to power. She posted a frantic, all-caps screed on the HOA website, declaring the emergency meeting illegal and in violation of the bylaws. She claimed it was a witch hunt orchestrated by disgruntled individuals with a vendetta. But it was too late. Nobody was listening to her anymore. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday night. The clubhouse, a sterile room usually reserved for sparsely attended board meetings and awkward potlucks, was packed to the rafters. Over 100 homeowners were there, standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of anger, anticipation, and liberation. Karen, Brenda, and Gary sat at a table at the front of the room, looking small and isolated. Karen tried to take control, banging a small gavel on the table and attempting to lecture the crowd about procedural rules. She was shouted down. Arthur Vance, calm and methodical, took the floor. He presented the motion for the audit, laying out the evidence of the inflated landscaping contract and the repeated refusal to provide financial transparency. He didn't have to argue hard. The residents were already convinced. The motion passed with a near unanimous show of hands. Karen's face was ashen. Next came the vote of no confidence. One by one, residents stood up and aired their grievances, telling stories of fines for holiday decorations, threats over the color of their mailboxes, and the general atmosphere of intimidation Karen had fostered. It was a public exorcism of years of petty tyranny. The accountant whose business sign she'd cited stood up and detailed how Karen had tried to use the HOA to shut down his home-based livelihood. The mother of the boy with the blue slide talked about the emotional distress it had caused her child. The vote was a landslide. Karen Patterson, Brenda May, and Gary Shipley were removed from the board, effective immediately. There was a moment of stunned silence, and then the room erupted in applause. Karen just sat there motionless, her face a blank mask of shock. Her reign was over. In the following weeks, the forensic audit commenced. The results were even worse than I had suspected. The auditors uncovered a systematic pattern of embezzlement. The landscaping contract was just the tip of the iceberg. Karen had been using the HOA's debit card for personal expenses. Lavish dinners, spa days, online shopping sprees. She had been falsifying invoices and creating phantom vendors to funnel money directly into her own accounts. The total amount stolen over her 5-year term was nearly $80,000. The new interim board, led by Arthur, immediately turned the auditor's report over to the county sheriff's department. A criminal investigation was launched. Warrants were issued. One morning, as I was running Titan on the obstacle course, I saw 2 sheriff's patrol cars pull up in front of Karen's house. I watched as 2 deputies escorted a handcuffed Karen Patterson out of her front door. She wasn't wearing her power suit or her pastel tracksuit. She was wearing sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, her face puffy from crying. She didn't look like a tyrant anymore. She just looked like a common criminal. But my own battle wasn't quite over. While the community was cleaning house, I had my lawyer file a civil suit against Karen personally. The suit was for defamation, due to the lies she had spread about me on the community Facebook page, and for tortious interference with a business contract, for her deliberate and malicious attempts to shut down my DoD program. My goal wasn't money. It was to ensure she was held accountable for her actions on every possible front, and to create a legal precedent that would protect me from any future harassment. Faced with a mountain of evidence, a criminal indictment, and the prospect of a civil trial where a decorated veteran and a Pentagon colonel might testify against her, Karen's legal position was untenable. Her lawyer quickly sought a settlement. I agreed on 2 conditions. First, she would issue a formal, public apology to me, to be posted on the new HOA website and printed in the local newspaper. Second, she and her husband would have to sell their house and move out of Eagles Crest within 6 months. My lawyer thought the second condition was unenforceable, but to our surprise, she agreed immediately. The public humiliation was too much to bear. She wanted out. Her downfall was total and complete. She had lost her power, her reputation, her friends, and now her home. All because she couldn't stand the sight of a man and his dogs on a piece of property she felt she should control. She had weaponized the rules to destroy me, and in the end, the rules, and a few much bigger guns, had destroyed her instead. The seasons turned. The oppressive heat of the Texas summer gave way to a mild, pleasant autumn. The for sale sign in Karen Patterson's yard was replaced by a sold sign. A young family with a golden retriever moved in, and the last vestiges of her toxic reign were gone. The Eagles Crest HOA, under the steady leadership of Arthur Vance and a new board of reasonable, service-oriented residents, was transformed. The ridiculous rules were rescinded. The budget was transparent. The community landscaping contract was put out to a competitive bid, and the new company did a better job for 30% less. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed from one of suspicion and resentment to one of genuine community. The civil suit settled, with Karen's public apology printed in the paper as promised. It was a stilted, lawyer-approved block of text, but it was there in black and white for all to see. My reputation was cleared, not that it mattered much to me, but it was a final, formal closing of the chapter. My work continued, uninterrupted. The dogs thrived. Titan perfected his apprehension and release technique. Nix's scent detection abilities became so acute she could identify one specific chemical compound out of a dozen similar ones. And Ghost, the big, quiet shepherd, learned to track a human scent over a mile of broken terrain. They were magnificent animals, and the peace and quiet of my property allowed me to focus entirely on honing their skills, on fulfilling the promise I had made to my friend Marcus so long ago. One crisp fall afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. A black government sedan crunched up my gravel driveway, and Colonel Matthews stepped out. He was in his civilian clothes today, a polo shirt and slacks, and he looked more relaxed than I had ever seen him. "Jack," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "just in the area. Thought I'd stop by and see how the assets are performing." We walked the property for over an hour. I showed him the dogs' progress, running them through their paces. He watched with a keen, professional eye, nodding in approval. He wasn't a dog handler, but he was a superb judge of talent and discipline, whether in men or in animals. "They're exceptional, Jack," he said as we stood by the fence, watching Nix joyfully chase a tennis ball after a difficult scent trial. "The program is exceeding all our expectations. The first field reports from the teams that trained with your earlier dogs are stellar. They're saving lives. You're saving lives." It was the highest praise he could give, and it meant more to me than any medal. We talked for a while about the HOA incident, as he called it. "You know," he said with a wry smile, "your situation has become a bit of a legend at the JAG office. They use it as a case study now in civilian military legal entanglements. It's a textbook example of asymmetrical response." I had to laugh. "I was just trying to get my neighbor to leave me alone, Colonel." "That's how it always starts," he said, his smile fading into a more serious expression. "But you did everything right. You documented. You followed the rules. You didn't lose your cool. And you knew when to call for backup. Most people don't understand that bureaucracy can be a weapon. And like any weapon, it can be turned against the person wielding it." He was right. Karen's undoing wasn't the dogs or me or even the Colonel's dramatic appearance. Her undoing was her own arrogance. She believed the rules were for other people, that her power was absolute. She never imagined that someone would bother to read the fine print, to use the system she worshipped to hold her accountable. Before he left, Colonel Matthews handed me a small frame certificate. It was a formal commendation from the Department of the Army, recognizing my unwavering dedication and exceptional performance in the face of significant civilian interference, ensuring the continued success of a program vital to national security. It was bureaucracy's way of saying thank you. I hung it on the wall in my office, next to a picture of Marcus and his dog, Aries. It felt right. The war was over. Peace had been restored, not just to my property, but to the entire community. I had come here seeking solitude to do my work, to honor a fallen friend. I had inadvertently found myself fighting a battle for the soul of a neighborhood, and in winning that fight, I had helped build the kind of community I hadn't even realized I was looking for. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the training field, I sat on my porch with a new addition to the team. He was a 3-month-old Malinois puppy, a clumsy ball of fur and needle-sharp teeth named Rogue. He was the next generation, the beginning of a new cycle. He tumbled over my boots, chasing a leaf blowing in the wind. Titan, the seasoned veteran, watched the puppy's antics with a patient, grandfatherly air. The quiet of the evening was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant laughter of the new neighbor's kids playing in their yard. This was what I had fought for. Not just the right to train my dogs, but the right to this peace, the right to do my duty, to honor my promise, in a place where the community was a source of support, not a battlefield. Rogue finally tired himself out and curled up at my feet, his small body rising and falling with each sleepy breath. I looked out over my land, my home. Justice, I reflected, is not always about grand courtroom victories or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's just the quiet, earned peace that comes after the storm, and it was a peace worth fighting for.